When I first started this, if you'd asked me the question, who is Charles Darwin, I'd have given you the standard answer. He's the father of modern evolutionary thought. But then the question beyond that is, who is Darwin the man? What events in his life shaped the way he thought? What did he actually think? Without understanding the biographical data, if you just read Origin of the Species or The Descent of Man or summations of all his analyses, it really didn't help me as much. I wanted to know about the man. To evaluate, if you will, his spiritual journey really taught me a lot about how he came to those conclusions ultimately. So I can't separate the events of his life from his conclusions, because the things in my past shape the way I think about the world and the way I analyze things, and the same can be said of Darwin's life. I wanted to know what really happened and what those circumstances really were. We're going to spend some time examining Darwin's early life. How did it influence what he ultimately came to believe? He was born February 12, 1809. For you history buffs, you may recognize that date. That's the same date that Abraham Lincoln was born. And much in the same way that in America we revere the birthplaces and homes of our national leaders, the same can be said for Darwin in England. He was born in Shrewsbury, England, in a place called the Mount, and it's still preserved to this day. This is a photograph of it as it exists, and this is the plaque on the door of the room where Charles Darwin was born. So instead of George Washington slept here, they say Charles Darwin was born here. So they get as much mileage out of Darwin in England as they can. He was born into a wealthy, leisured class, and by that I mean he never had to dig ditches or chop down trees or roof houses. His family was very established as far as they were very secure financially. They were in the appropriate place in society. They were of the gentry class, if you will. They were very secure. They were very influential politically. As a child, he was christened into the Church of England, which I find kind of fascinating, because if you read the things his father actually wrote and what his father thought about the church and thought about things religious at the time, you'll find that this christening was really more a social issue than a religious issue. It really wasn't an acknowledgement by the family that there was any importance or that they agreed with a dogma or a creed to the church. This was just something that the people in that strata of society did. It was the proper thing to do. His mother took him to the Unitarian Church when he was small, and this is actually the church where Charles Darwin was taken, so much so they have the obligatory sign out front, Charles Darwin worshiped here. What about his family? He actually had a really interesting family. His grandfather, Dr. Erasmus Darwin, was actually quite the rascal in his day. He was a physician, he was a poet, he was what they called a free thinker. We may call him a radical. But he was quite an interesting man. He promoted an evolutionary philosophy. This is something he wrote. I want to see if you find anything vaguely familiar in this. Organic life beneath the shoreless waves was born and nursed in ocean's pearly caves. First forms minute, unseen by spirit glass, move on the mud or pierce the watery mass. These as successive generations bloom, new powers acquire, and larger limbs assume. This was written around 1800. You know, it sounds like I could have read that in my high school biology book just a few years, well, maybe more than a few years ago. But anyway, this sounds a little bit evolutionary to me, doesn't it to you? Well, Dr. Erasmus died in 1802, and Darwin never knew him personally, but he read his poetry, he read his works. He wrote a work called Zoonomia, which Charles was very familiar with in later life, and ultimately did influence him as he started to gather his thoughts and assess the data that he acquired during his voyage later in his life. Charles' father, Dr. Robert Darwin, was also a physician, and he was very well respected in his community, particularly for one aspect of his practice. He was said to be a very, very good communicator. He took the time and listened to his patients, which is actually a lesson physicians to this day can learn better. But more than being a good physician, he was a very shrewd investor. He invested very wisely. He owned almost everything in the community. It was said he owned half the community and knew the medical secrets of the other half. He was a very shrewd investor. He invested so wisely that Charles himself really never had to do a hard day's work in his life. He provided very well for his family. But as Charles was growing, he shared his father Robert's interest in nature, and particularly things of gardening and issues of horticulture. They used to spend lots of time in the garden, and that's where Charles' interest in nature and his interest in observing things really started to grow. In the late 1700s, early 1800s, the culture in England and Europe was undergoing a lot of changes. You know, the effects of the Industrial Revolution were changing society. There were a lot of wage and worker issues. There were a lot of class rivalries. And also at this time, there was the onset of new political thought. The free thinkers, perhaps, maybe is the best way to put it, questioning the status quo. There were people who were starting to greatly resent the Church of England, the state church, because some people said at that time you really couldn't separate the Church of England from the government because it had inordinate power. And at that time, the Church of England was still fairly conservative. This compromise was just starting to enter the Church of England. There were many godly men, both theologians and scientists, who upheld God's Word, but the compromise was starting at that time, questioning the age of the earth, questioning the historicity of Genesis. You know, also in scientific and philosophic circles, there were great winds of change blowing through. Rationalism and naturalism were starting to be the order of the day, if you will. Rationalism basically saying autonomous human reason. Man's reason is supreme. You know, man is a power to reason. We can analyze our problems, and man can become better and better and better over time. And that's just going to, you know, lead to a glorious conclusion to mankind. And naturalism, basically, you know, the laws of nature at work. You know, there's never been any outside power, or there's never been any God who had any input on the world that we see. Everything that operates now pretty much has operated in the past. And see, it was that kind of thinking into which Charles Darwin was born. His education was pretty standard for a child of his age. At age 8, he attended a Unitarian day school, but the next year he was sent off to boarding school, the Shrewsbury Grammar School. There he studied the classics and the New Testament. He was said to have disliked both. But Shrewsbury's goal was actually to prepare young men of appropriate social standing, if you will, to enter Oxford and Cambridge. It was supposed to set them on the appropriate social path of education and social standing for later in life. At age 16, he was packed up, sent to Edinburgh to become a doctor. He was going to follow in the family tradition. Granddad was a doctor, father was a doctor, he was going to be a doctor. Actually, his older brother, who was also named Erasmus, went to medical school but never actually practiced. Charles had a problem with medical school. He got to the anatomy lab and to the operating theaters, and he found out that they were kind of gory and gross, and he didn't like them. Now, I remember when I was in medical school, there were some, you know, kind of tough things to see because you're talking about very sick people and very dire circumstances, but you have to judge Charles Darwin by a different standard because these were the days before anesthesia. There was a problem. Surgeons were not judged by skill. They were judged by what? Speed. Now see, it passes my mind if I'm going to have a heart transplant. I want the surgeon to take his time. However, if I'm having an amputation without anesthesia, I want him to be what? Really quick. So Charles got to the operating theater and said, this is a little bit more than I can stand. I don't think I want to go to medical school anymore. I don't think I have what it takes to be a doctor. And frankly, I'm going to cut Charles a little slack here. I've been to medical school, but thank goodness it was in the anesthesia days. That would have been very, very difficult to stomach. Almost instinctively, he knew he preferred the quiet pleasures of the natural history sciences, probably because there was much less screaming. By the time the summer recess of 1826 came around, he was privately certain about needing to give up medicine. The catch, how do I tell my father? Dad, I don't want to be a doctor. That's kind of tough. He was very properly vehement against my turning an idle sporting man, which then seemed my probable destination. Darwin was in a well-to-do family, so it wasn't like he had to go out and dig ditches and chop wood for a living. So he enjoyed his time off, his observing nature and taking hikes, and he loved hunting and shooting birds and things like this. And so in his discussions with his father about what to do, his father was concerned that he would become, I believe, what Darwin described as an idle sporting man. He really was kind of afraid of that, and at one point his father said, you care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you're going to be a disgrace to yourself and your entire family. And so there was a little bit of consternation in the family about what Charles was going to do. But his father, in addition to being a well-respected physician, was a very pragmatic man. So he thought, well, we need to find something, a reasonable social occupation for Charles, so what better place than to serve in the church? So it was decided that Charles would enter the clergy. He would go to Cambridge, he would study theology, and he would take the church orders, and so he would be a parish clergyman, if you will. These parish positions could be purchased or gotten with political influence in those days. So what they envisioned at that point was Charles would have a nice steady income. He would sort of be a respectable member of the church. He would run his little parish. He'd have plenty of time for his shooting and other natural activities. And so really it wasn't like he had this great calling from the Lord to go out and save souls and work in God's kingdom, because if you read the quotes that Charles had during his time in college, he was never committed to theology. He was intrigued by some of Paley's writings and things like that, but he never had a heart commitment to the clergy. So it was really a way to maintain a respectable social position, have a good income, and not be, shall we say, a disappointment to the family. What did Charles think about it? I asked for some time to consider, as from what little I had heard and thought on the subject, I had scruples about declaring my belief in all the dogmas of the Church of England, though otherwise I liked the thought of being a country clergyman. And as I did not then in the least doubt the strict and literal truth of every word of the Bible, I soon persuaded myself that our creed must be fully accepted. It never struck me how illogical it was to say that I believed in what I could not understand and what is in fact unintelligible. Again, do you see any level of commitment? There's an intellectual assent to some of this stuff may be true, but it wasn't like I would want my pastor to be on fire for the Lord. This was a very pragmatic social decision. During his time at Cambridge, his interest centered more on botany and beetles than theology. He got really interested in collecting things and collecting bugs and beetles, which to me is kind of disquieting, but he really was fascinated particularly by beetles. But he never really got caught up in this purpose, this sense of commitment that you needed to be an adequate clergyman. Is that just my opinion? No, I'm going to recount a conversation that he had. Darwin asked Herbert, who was one of his friends, whether he really felt inwardly moved by the Holy Spirit to enter the church. When the bishop put the question to him in the ordination service, what would he reply? No, answered Herbert, he could not say he felt moved. Darwin chimed in, neither can I, and therefore I cannot take the orders. He could not assent to the orders of the church. So even though he was studying to be a clergyman, he said, I can't commit myself to this. This is not something I feel led to do. So here's a problem. Medicine wasn't for me. Studied to be a clergyman, but I really don't feel compelled to take church orders. What do I do with myself? Well, as luck would have it in his life, a letter soon arrived. Would he like an ocean voyage? Would he like a voyage of a couple of years going and studying things in a foreign land? He said, why not? He was invited to join the company of the HMS Beagle. The ship was actually supposed to be like a 2-year voyage. It ended up being closer to a 5-year voyage. It lasted from December 1831 till October of 1836. The purpose of the voyage initially was to conduct surveys along the coast of South America. They're so-called hydrographic studies. Because you remember England at this time had a great navy. There's a lot of seagoing commerce, and what they wanted was analysis of the shorelines and the harbors and the reefs and the different currents and tides. They wanted a good analysis of this area because it would aid them in shipping and commerce, and that was the purpose of the voyage. The ship was commanded by Captain Robert Fitzroy, who had a problem. He was going to be on this boat with a lot of sailors for a long time. But see, due to the social differences and the social system at the time, plus just the constraints of military order and discipline, he couldn't just sit down and have his meals with the ordinary seamen. He couldn't, sit around and play cards or do whatever they would do for recreation. He couldn't socialize with these men. He had to have a gentleman companion. Thus, Darwin joined the expedition basically to be Captain Fitzroy's companion. On a ship for 5 years, I could imagine there would be times I would get tense with just about anybody, and he and Captain Fitzroy did have their moments. There were some discussions about slavery and other issues where there were some sort of contentious moments, but for the most part, they got along well on the boat. They enjoyed each other's company, but there was a problem. Captain Fitzroy was what we would now call a young earth creationist, if you will. And over the voyage, Darwin did not necessarily share these views. Now, in later years, Captain Fitzroy had serious reservations about Darwin's ideas. He was afterwards very indignant with me for having published so unorthodox a book for he became very religious, as The Origin of Species. When Darwin finally published his observation and coalesced his ideas, Captain Fitzroy was not too crazy about this whole concept, so much so that this was said. I shall never forget the meeting of the combined sections of the British Association when at Oxford in 1860, where Admiral Fitzroy expressed his sorrows for having given you the opportunity of collecting facts for such a shocking theory as yours. Later on, he actually regretted taking Darwin on the voyage because it allowed him to make the observations that ultimately led to what Captain Fitzroy said is an unbiblical, unscriptural idea. One of the curious aspects of this is before they went on board the boat, Captain Fitzroy gave Darwin a copy of the book Principles of Geology by Lyell, which was the first in a multi-volume set about the geology of the world, arguing for a concept called uniformitarianism, or the long ages. So here you've got Darwin more and more and more accepting the long ages, a uniformitarian geological view of the things he was seeing. And here's Captain Fitzroy, who's a young Earth creationist. So there were some unique aspects to that relationship. While on board, Darwin read the first 2 volumes of the book Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell was the man who's probably given the most credit for developing this concept of what's called uniformitarianism, the millions of years idea. His idea was the same processes are going on at the present, in the present, same rates as going on in the present, what accounts for everything we see in the past. The present's the key to the past, if you will. Darwin spent 39 months on land, 18 months at sea. And something that the average person does not understand about these voyages, the majority of Darwin's observations were geologic rather than zoologic. Well, what do we know Darwin for? Yeah, natural selection, origin of the species, evolution, all his observations, if you will, about biological issues. But the vast majority of his writings on the Beagle were geologic. He wrote 1,383 pages in his journal on geologic issues and only 368 pages on zoologic issues. And that is surprising to most people. Actually, as I researched this, it was surprising to me. He was more captivated by the geology of South America than the biology of South America. Lyell's book had a huge impact on Darwin because, again, it argues for uniformitarianism. You know, the present's the key to the past. The geologic processes we see today have operated the same way in the past, and that's how we have the different formations and the strata and the upheavals and all the different physical aspects of the surface of the earth that we see. And so as he reported those things, and he would send these reports back to England during the stopovers for the boat, the people in England became very excited because they couldn't wait for Darwin to get back and report these things about the geology that he'd seen. But see, all his geologic observations were ultimately based on the concept of long ages because he became so captivated with that. Certainly from his early studies in geology in school with Sedgwick and some of the professors that he dealt with there, but primarily through the writings of Lyell. His best known observations were from where? The Galapagos, the islands about 600 miles west of Ecuador. Here they are, little tiny islands. He was only there for a few weeks. But what's surprising to people is he didn't really go to the Galapagos and have what we call a eureka moment. He didn't go, wow, I've got it figured out. You know what he was doing? He was collecting specimens. All throughout his voyages, all throughout the 5 years of the voyages, he was collecting specimens, trying to prepare them, pack them, crate them. He was sending them back to England. He was sending them back to England. He was taking notes, but he didn't have time to sit down and go through these things in great detail. He was only on the Galapagos for a few weeks. He packed up all these specimens, particularly the finch specimens and things, shipped them back to England. It wasn't until years later that he really understood what even some of these specimens were. So it wasn't like he got there, saw the turtles or saw the finches and said, wow, I've got this idea. It was something that sort of, shall we say, grew and grew and grew over the years after he returned from his voyage. For example, when he sent these samples back, when he came back to England, he didn't all the time sit down and go through the samples himself. He would farm some of these samples out to the other learned men that he had come to know, whether they were fossil samples or plant samples or different kinds of things, to the people who were more expert in that area. For example, there was a man named John Gould, who was an ornithologist, who actually did most of the research and observations on the bird specimens from the Galapagos. Darwin had actually misclassified some of these specimens, which I can understand. He was in a hurry, thought maybe one of these was a wren or something. Turned out there were different kinds of finches, and Gould identified the different beak configurations, and this led to a lot of Darwin's later ideas about the variation, but see, it wasn't like Darwin made the primary analysis while he was on the island. These observations were made much, much later. But what did he actually think while he was on the boat? What was his spiritual condition? While on board the Beagle, I was quite orthodox, but I'd gradually come by this time to see that the Old Testament, from its manifestly false history of the world, was no more to be trusted than the sacred books of the Hindus or the beliefs of any barbarian. Okay, he's in his mid-20s, he's on the boat. He said the Old Testament is a manifestly false history of the world. It's no more to be believed than any other sacred book. It's no better than any other book. What would I say about the history in the Old Testament here? It's the true history of the universe. It's the true history of the world. What did Darwin say? It's a manifestly false history of the world. After the boat returned, he visited his family, got over being seasick, and began writing his journals. He prepared a series on the zoology of the voyage, and then, strangely enough, he began an 8-year study of barnacles. Now, I can think of few things duller than studying barnacles for 8 years. However, to give Darwin credit, this is still considered by many to be one of the definitive works on barnacles ever. It was very, very thorough. He studied thousands and thousands and thousands of barnacles. I could have done that for about 6 hours. He did it for 8 years. But it was a wonderful, very scholarly work. In January 1839, he married Emma Wedgwood, his first cousin. And Emma was a very religious woman. Now, was that a problem? Well, there were issues. There were issues. Because at this point, Charles really wasn't a religious man. Remember, he couldn't take the church orders. He'd thrown away the history in Genesis. Remember, the history of the Old Testament was a manifestly false view of history. So he had no conception of biblical authority. So what did he believe? He was about to marry this very religious woman. So in a conversation with his father, he was told this: "Before I was engaged to be married, my father advised me to conceal carefully my doubts. Some women suffered miserably by doubting about the salvation of their husband." This was 20 years before Origin of Species. Charles was 29 years old. Here he's being told, you've got doubts, don't share them with your wife, because you know how wives are. If you're going to die and not be in heaven, it's a problem. You know, if you're not a saved man, you know, don't don't, you know, don't ask, don't tell, that kind of thing. He was advised by his father. Now, if Darwin was a saved man, if he had a saving relationship with Jesus Christ, why would that even be an issue? So here at age 29, he's essentially admitting, I had no personal relationship with the Lord, but I just didn't want to tell my wife because I know it's going to upset her. They first lived in London, and in 1842 they moved to Down Village in Kent, to what's now known as Down House. They had 10 children over the years, 1839 to 1856. 3 of the children died in infancy or childhood. During this time, he also started a series of private notebooks. And in these notebooks, he had sort of his thoughts and the beginnings of what he called transmutation. In other words, animals changing. He noticed as he got these observations back and he started collecting all the data from all the different fossils and plants and birds that his fellow scientists and naturalists were helping him analyze, he said, looks like these things do change a little bit. And he began to think, this is going to be a problem, because even back then he knew that if this were true, ultimately it would even have to include man. And he knew the religious consequences, that how it would be accepted by the church very poorly, as you might expect, how it would affect his family, how it would even be accepted by other naturalists, because it was a fairly radical idea. Even though there had been some evolutionary thought, his grandfather Erasmus had even promoted some evolutionary type thinking. But when you coalesce this together and say, my observations indicate that, he knew ultimately it would end up also including man, and that would take man off his exalted pedestal, and that would be a problem in the church. He certainly did not want to be shunned by his fellow scientists. When he got back, he was already a fairly famous man, just from the writings and the things he'd sent back from the Beagle voyages. He was accepted more and more into the scientific community, and that was certainly to be desired by an up-and-coming naturalist. And promoting a radical idea might damage those relationships and things, because some of the people who were his most staunch supporters were ultimately not happy about this whole concept of natural selection. Even to the point where Darwin died, some of his closest allies still had not really gotten on board, if you will. They didn't really accept it. But there was a big issue with Darwin too, and that was in his family, particularly his relationship with his wife Emma. She was a religious lady, and he loved her very much, and she loved him. They had a wonderful life together, and he was always cognizant of her feelings. And so he was initially very hesitant for all those reasons, because he knew the church would object. He was afraid of how his fellow scientists and naturalists might react to it. He was particularly concerned about how Emma might react to it. So he did struggle with these issues. It wasn't like he was out to destroy Christianity or that he was a God hater, things that we've heard about Darwin, which are just not true. But he knew the ultimate consequences. Even at the formative stages, he knew deep down, if this plays out like I think it might, the ultimate end point is going to be man. And that's going to be a real issue. He was very hesitant to publish this for many, many years. You know why? He was afraid of how it was going to be accepted. How were his fellow naturalists going to accept it? How was the church going to accept it? How was his family going to accept it? He knew even at the fledgling stages of this thought process what the ultimate outcome could be. And he knew it was not going to be well accepted. Over time, he did begin to discuss his idea with friends. His closest confidants said, "What do you think about this? I've got this idea." He would give them short excerpts from the journal to look at. "What do you think? What do you think?" And in this intellectual circle, it began to be better accepted. They began to say, "Well, this is not unreasonable." And again, you're not talking about people who accepted Genesis as real history. You're talking about people who by that time had accepted the compromise, that the Old Testament is a manifestly false history. We got here through natural processes. This whole concept of rationalism and naturalism had taken over, and that's the framework upon which they analyzed all this data, if you will. In the mid-late 1850s, he began to correspond with a gentleman named Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a naturalist who at the time was in the Pacific area and was sending back lots of observations. And Wallace was actually honored to be corresponding with Darwin. Darwin was, by that time, a very well-known, very well-respected naturalist. And then Wallace submitted some papers to the scientific societies in England. And one of his papers proposed a process which was very suspiciously like Darwin's natural selection ideas. And this was a concern for Darwin because, remember, in scientific circles, the person that proposes the idea first gets the credit. And to be fair, there were some differences, and Darwin had made his ideas known to his colleagues over the previous few years, but this ultimately pushed Darwin to make a public presentation of his ideas. So it was really, at that point, he had no choice because Wallace's observations ultimately could have led him to the same conclusion. And if Darwin hadn't gone ahead at that point, he had 15 years of work into this at this point, or possibly more, and he had to do something. Darwin went to his friends and said, "You know, I've been working on this for years, but here's Wallace's ideas. What do I do with this? What do I do with this information?" So basically, this was the idea they came up with. On July 1st, 1858, Darwin's views were first presented publicly sort of as a co-idea or co-authored, if you will, between Darwin and Wallace. But guess who got top billing? Darwin. Wallace, throughout his life, was surprisingly collegial about this and accepted this pretty much without a fight. But this is where Darwin's ideas first went public. November 22nd, 1859, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races and the Struggle for Life went on sale to the public. In 1866, the term survival of the fittest was coined by Herbert Spencer. That term was actually not in The Origin of the Species. This was when the term actually came to be into popular use. In 1871, the book The Descent of Man and Selection with Relation to Sex was published, the second of his major works. Now, what was he thinking during this time? I mean, did he know what the consequences of this type of thought? What was this thought process ultimately going to lead to? What was his spiritual condition? What was he thinking? My Descent of Man was published in February 1871. As soon as I had become, in the year 1837 or 1838, convinced that species were mutable productions, I could not avoid the belief that man must come under the same law. 34 years before The Descent of Man was published, he understood what the ultimate outcome of this idea would be. If one kind of creature changed into another kind of creature, and over millions of years things got more complex and more complex and more complex, why would man be any different? He knew 3 decades before where that was going to lead. It was not a new thought to him as these works were published. It wasn't like it came to him later. He knew what the progression was going to be. Although the origin of species, the derivation of any particular species is never discussed, yet I thought it best, in order that no honorable man should accuse me of concealing my views, to add that by the work in question, light would be thrown on the origin of man and his history. Even at the time of origin of species, he was firm in his conviction, he was firm in his understanding that man must fall under the same law of nature. Why was it a problem? Just this. A man who has no assured, never-present belief in the existence of a personal God or of a future existence with retribution and reward can have for the rule of his life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest or which seem to him the best ones. This is what Darwin understood. If there's no God, if there's no Creator, there's no ultimate authority. What's going to control man's behavior? Only those impulses that man himself deems best. So it's not just necessarily a biological progression. The church is going to not understand, or my family's not going to accept it, the naturalists aren't going to accept it because they don't want to accept that man's just the product of evolution or natural selection over millions of years from lower animals. We've got a problem with behavior. We've got a problem with morality. Because if there's no God, if there's no ultimate authority, what controls our behavior? Only our own best impulses. He began his autobiography in 1876, and this was intended to be just a collection of sort of anecdotes and short stories and just sort of scraps of his life that he was going to leave for his children and his family. But after his death, it was published in an abridged version, and then the unabridged version was published. And before the end of his life, he embarked on another study of earthworms, and actually a quite scholarly work on earthworms. He always continued to observe. He was actually a pretty good observer. I would differ with him on some of the conclusions he drew from his observations, but he was quite the thorough observer. Charles Darwin died in 1882 at age 73. Amazingly enough, Charles Darwin was buried in Westminster Abbey. He was buried next to John Herschel, the astronomer, and near the monument to Isaac Newton. This was accomplished because a lot of his close friends had a lot of influence with the politicians of the day, and they made arrangements to have Darwin buried at the Abbey. But was that what Darwin would have wanted? Emma knew that Darwin expected to be buried in Down Churchyard alongside Erasmus, that's his brother Erasmus, and the Darwin's two dead babies, the sweetest place on earth, he had once remarked. There was great disappointment in Down that he was not buried there, agreed Parslow. He loved the place, and we think he would rather have rested there had he been consulted. Parslow was Darwin's butler for many, many years. And they said, you know, if he'd gotten his druthers, he would have just been buried in the churchyard there with his family. Instead, they made a political icon out of him. Amazingly, some religious observers commented on Darwin's noble character. True Christians, an Anglican tabloid urged, far from fearing lest the sacred pavement of the Abbey should cover a secret enemy of the faith, may rejoice in Darwin's burial at Westminster as a visible sign of the reconciliation between faith and science. Wow, this is a great thing. He's brought faith and science together. It's a wonderful thing. This man who's done so much for the church is buried in Westminster Abbey. That's how far in that short a period of time the compromise had reached. Here's a question. Did Charles Darwin recant? Was there a deathbed confession? People will come up and say, isn't it wonderful that Darwin recanted evolution on his deathbed? People have said or accepted the concept that Darwin accepted Jesus Christ or became a Christian on his deathbed, that he said he regretted ever coming up with the idea of evolution. And the historical analysis of that story just doesn't support those conclusions. It's an urban legend in the church. And certainly for me, it's unfortunate that he didn't, because to me that would mean that Darwin closed his eyes in death without a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ, which is the ultimate tragedy. But so many people use this story to go to evolutionists and say, see, even Darwin knew this wasn't true. And when people use that as an evidence, what they really end up doing is damaging their own credibility, because the historical analysis of this just doesn't bear any of the story out. There were a few minor reports within the first few weeks after Darwin died, but the main report that keeps getting promoted, if you will, comes from a story that was published in 1915 in Massachusetts. There was a lady named Lady Hope who was an evangelist in the area near where Darwin lived, near Down, and supposedly she visited Darwin before his death. And she claimed that Darwin was reading the Bible and expressed a lot of regret about his evolutionary theories. And in actuality, it is very likely that she did visit Darwin, but the rest of her story just doesn't hold water. Several people have investigated this very thoroughly and have actually come up with a range of dates where she may have visited Darwin, where certain family members were and weren't there. One of the things that she claimed in her story was he had been bedridden for several months before his death, and that was not true. She visited him apparently in the early autumn, the year before he died. Just a lot of historical inconsistencies. So the story just really doesn't hold up. And to me, the most striking thing is, if the story were true, why did she wait 33 years before telling it? And then she told it in another nation, across the ocean. She told the story in America. Ultimately, Darwin's family has denied the stories from the time of his death up until, until they passed away. What about Darwin's spiritual journey? I mean, we've talked about the biographical aspects of his life. What did he actually believe? Well, he rejected the arguments of design. When he was in college, he read William Paley's The Evidences of Christianity and Natural Theology. That's where this whole concept of designer was set forth. If you find something, it looks designed, it implies a designer. And originally he felt that those were relatively compelling arguments, I guess, but later in his life he began to reject that. My theology is a simple muddle. I cannot look at the universe as a result of blind chance, yet I can see no evidence of beneficent design, or indeed of design of any kind in the details. Now that's about as muddled as you can be. This cannot be blind chance, but I don't see any evidence of design. I'm trying to think if there's a third option here. I can see why he's a little bit confused. When thus reflecting, I feel compelled to look to a first cause having an intelligent mind in some degree analogous to that of man, and I deserve to be called a theist. This conclusion was strong in my mind about the time, as far as I can remember, when I wrote Origin of Species. And since that time has become very gradually, with many fluctuations, become weaker and weaker. I gradually came to disbelieve in Christianity as a divine revelation. He was fascinated by many things, just the whole philosophical issue of religion. But I think during the course of his life, what he ended up doing was becoming more and more disillusioned, because remember, he'd given up the history in Genesis. On the Beagle, he said he became to accept the history of the Old Testament as a manifestly false history of the world. So that foundation had already been walked away from in his early 20s. And so as his life went on, as the events of his life unfolded, what he did, he lost more and more and more even intellectual consent to the possibility of Christianity. So it wasn't like he was a Christian and walked away. I've seen that in print. I've heard people in sermons actually make that statement. But if you really look closely at what Charles wrote himself, not what I believe or what somebody, but read the quotes, read the time frame where he made these statements, there really was no heartfelt commitment to Christianity. He was a proponent of the rationalistic thinking of his day. He was certainly a product of his environment. This whole dependence on rationalism and naturalism, he bought into that. He said there's no, divine spark in any of this. He had given up the whole concept of design. So man's reason is supreme. Man's reason is paramount. This is of no effect. It's whatever man thinks is correct. Even human thoughts, Darwin provocatively wrote in his notebook, were little more than secretions from the brain. No more wonderful than inert matter being subject to gravitation. Oh, you materialist, he gleefully sputtered in conclusion. He was almost excited about the process. Even human thought are just chemicals bumping together. So in that viewpoint, what is man? We're Mother Nature's science project, right? We're just chemicals that have bumped together. That's what our thoughts are. They're just chemicals bumping together. Here we go. Although I did not think much about the existence of a personal God until a considerably later period of my life. I didn't think about the existence of a personal God until later? I don't see a lot of evidence that he thought about a personal God very much at all. Nor must we overlook the probability of the constant inculcation and a belief in God on the minds of children, producing so strong and perhaps an inherited effect on their brains not yet fully developed. It would be as difficult for them to throw off their belief in God as for a monkey to throw off its instinctive fear and hatred of a snake. A child believes in God. Why? Because they've been programmed to. Because their mommies and daddies make them. This belief has been inculcated, and all of a sudden it becomes almost an instinctive thing. They can't get rid of concept of God any more than a monkey can throw off its instinctive fear of a snake. That's what he thought. That was his spiritual state at the time. I can indeed hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true. For if so, the plain language of the text seems to show that the men who do not believe, and this would include my father, brother, and almost all my best friends, would be everlastingly punished. And this is a damnable doctrine. This was one thing that Darwin wrote that was particularly painful to his wife, Emma. And when his autobiography was first published, this was taken out. It was later in the unabridged version put back in. But this was a little bit of an area of contention between them. But he knew the outcome of his ideas. He knew the ultimate moral outcome of his ideas. But he says, I can't believe Christianity to be true because all these good people I know are going to be everlastingly punished. You know what one part of the equation he consistently left out? The effect of sin. He never acknowledged that there's nobody innocent. And that was a problem. Ultimately, this was the issue. Death and suffering. If there's one thing that troubled Darwin, if there's one thing he was himself inconsistent about, it was the issue of death and suffering. You know, he had a problem with this whole concept of death and suffering. You know, how could the benevolent Christian God allow death and suffering, allow all the horrible things he saw in the world, all this predation that he saw, the disease, all the death, animals ripping each other up, and he never really could reconcile that. And he saw death around him. I mean, he had colleagues, he had people that he knew whose wives died in childbirth, things of that nature. He had a couple of children that died in infancy. His second child, Annie, died when she was young. She had a rather protracted illness and she died, and it was a horrible experience for Darwin. He just couldn't understand how a dear and good child like Annie could have died. But at the same time, he had no real problem with the concept of natural selection being the cause of this death and suffering. He had no problem with natural selection being the driving force in a world where there was a lot of predation and survival of the fittest, things like that. So if God was involved, Darwin had a problem with it. But if natural selection were the causative agent, if you will, he really had no problem with it. He was able to reconcile that, at least in his own mind. So the thing is, he really had the wrong starting point. Now, some claim that Darwin walked away from Christianity when his daughter Annie died. Annie was described as a dear and good child. It was Darwin's second child. She was born in 1841, died in 1851 after a prolonged illness. Now, this is why some Darwin biographers and Darwin apologists want to say he was a Christian up to this point, because he made this statement: I never gave up Christianity till I was 40 years of age. Now, I really cannot see anything in Darwin's writing or his life at any point where he would be a Christian in the biblical sense, where he had a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. But at 40 years of age, he gave up Christianity. Now, I submit to you that that quote means he gave up any intellectual consent to Christianity, that he gave up any intellectual idea that perhaps there's anything truthful in it. This was not a heart issue for him, it was a head issue. And at this point, he may have given it up. But I cannot see anything in his life that would indicate that he was a true Christian in the sense that the Bible requires. At this point, he gave up his intellectual consent. I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the Ichneumonidae with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars, that a cat should play with mice. Look at this horrible, look at all these horrible things that go on. How could a benevolent God let all this happen? What kind of wonderful, loving God is this? It may be asked, how can the generally beneficent arrangement of the world be accounted for? Some writers indeed are so much impressed with the amount of suffering in the world that they doubt if we look to all sentient beings whether there is more of misery or of happiness, whether the world as a whole is a good one or a bad one. According to my judgment, happiness decidedly prevails, though this would be very difficult to prove. If the truth of this conclusion be granted, it harmonizes well with the effect which we might expect from natural selection. All sentient beings have been formed so as to enjoy, as a general rule, happiness. I've read this several times and I can't quite figure this out. If God's in charge and there's suffering, that's a bad thing. But as a general rule, as I look at it, according to Darwin, happiness prevails, which is what we might expect from natural selection. Yeah, I'm confused too. If God's in charge and they're suffering, it's bad, but I don't really see that because according to this, happiness prevails. This very old argument from the existence of suffering against the existence of an intelligent first cause seems to me a strong one. Whereas, as just remarked, the presence of much suffering agrees well with the view that all organic beings have been developed through variation and natural selection. Here he says there's suffering, but it's consistent with variation and natural selection, which is what would be required. Survival of the fittest. Strong creatures survive, weak creatures fall by the wayside. But then in the other quote he says, generally it looks like things were designed to be happy. No wonder he considered his theology a simple muddle. Nature's depravity cried out against a noble providence. Good grief, Darwin spurted in the next breath. What a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering, low and hardly cruel works of nature. Now that's an unhappy man right there. There are some days I think Darwin just needed a nap and a hug. How could faith in the holiness of God have arisen amid the death, famine, wars of Semitic tribes? No, Charles insisted, the religious instinct has evolved with society. The primitive Jewish God whose atrocities had lit up hellfires in Christendom could be nothing but a barbaric tyrant. How could a loving God allow death and suffering? And you know, that's a question that still goes on today. We get that question all the time. The world throws that at us. Hey, Christian, how could your loving God allow death and suffering? How could these things be so? This loving God, what about children starving in Africa? What about all these horrible things? What about shootings? What about school violence? Christian, you're inconsistent. Do you have answers? Actually, we do. Unfortunately, the church fails us today just like the church failed Darwin in his day. They didn't equip people to have answers. They didn't stand boldly on the Scripture from the very first verse. You look at the life of one of the men who's considered one of the greatest scientists of history, his conclusions were ultimately shaped by a church and a society that failed to uphold the authority of the Word of God. So his observations were framed on a worldview that had no biblical foundation. So he came to conclusions that I think are unsupportable. Because I can look at the world around me, you know, what we see in God's world really does agree with what we read in God's Word. I can, as a scientist, look at the world and test and analyze things. It's all consistent with what God tells me in His Word. I have a consistent worldview. So it's not really about the evidence, it's about the starting point. The same can be said for Darwin. He had a humanistic, naturalistic, rationalistic starting point, and that's the framework on which he hung his observations, and that ultimately shaped his conclusions. That's a lesson for us all to learn to this day. In conclusion, we can say this about Darwin's life. He was never a Christian in the biblical sense. He never had a saving relationship with Jesus Christ. And that's an eternal tragedy. I weep when I think about that. But based on what the man wrote, there was no heart consent. There's no heart knowledge of Jesus Christ. He rejected the historicity of Genesis 1-11. Early on, even on the Beagle, he said the Old Testament is a manifestly false history of the world. He gave up the true history in Genesis. He gave up the foundation. Then over the years, after he returned, his ideas coalesced. He began to collect all the data and all these observations from all the other scientists who helped him analyze his collection. And he was an unbiased observer, right? He took all these evidences and all this data and just came to a scientific conclusion, right? Just totally unbiased, right? Wrong. He was not an unbiased observer. And guess what, folks? I'm not an unbiased observer, and neither are you. I'm going to tell you right up front, this is the foundation of what I think. This is the foundation of what I believe. This is the foundation upon which I observe and understand and interpret everything I see around me. The facts don't speak for themselves. Whether it's finches or fossils or rock layers, your starting point, your worldview determines the conclusions you reach. The same can be said for Darwin. He rejected the true history of the world. He rejected the true history in Genesis. He said the world is very ancient, and upon that foundation, he built his ideas. So he was certainly not unbiased. What can we learn? Very simply this: God's wisdom is always greater than man's wisdom. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God, for it is written, He taketh the wise in their own craftiness. The church was compromised in Darwin's time, and it's even more compromised today. Remember, at that time, rationalism and materialism were just creeping into the church. But all you have to do is look around you today and see where the compromises led us. I'm going to give you just a small example. The Bible began with the assumption that God had created a finished and perfect world from which human beings had fallen away in an act of cosmic rebellion. Original sin was the reality in which all life was presumed to live. Darwin postulated instead an unfinished and thus imperfect creation out of which human life was still evolving. Human beings did not fall from perfection into sin as the church had taught for centuries. We were evolving, and indeed are still evolving, into higher levels of consciousness. Thus, the basic myth of Christianity that interpreted Jesus as a divine emissary who came to rescue the victims of the fall from the results of their original sin became inoperative. Bishop John Shelby Spong, who at one time was the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Newark, he's been a visiting lecturer at Harvard and spoken at many colleges and universities, and he's quite a well-known writer in certain circles. Basically, he says the myth of Christianity that interpreted Jesus as a divine emissary, if that's a myth, what purpose is there to Scripture anyway, folks? Seems to me that he's taken the entire heart out of the gospel. This is the compromise the church has come to today. Romans 1:20 says this, "From the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." Now, folks, that's the ultimate result of the compromise, but we are all without excuse. Charles Darwin was without excuse. I'm without excuse. You are without excuse. The greatest tragedy, the thing we should learn from Darwin's life more than anything else, more than the science, more than the biographical issues, more than the philosophical meanderings that we could embark upon, is this. The lesson to be learned from Charles Darwin's life is that there's a soul been lost for eternity. That man closed his eyes in death without a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. The one thing that I took away from my study of Darwin's life was the fact that he really didn't walk away from the faith as one watershed event. You know, I'd always heard that he studied for, to be a pastor. He studied theology, and that he'd walked away from Christianity when his daughter died. But when you actually read what Darwin wrote, if you read through the events of his life, this was a process rather than an event. And that's the thing I took away more than anything else, because this was a lifelong shaping of the man's thought processes, which led him to ultimately the conclusions he reached. It wasn't that he had a commitment to the church, had a commitment to God, and because his daughter died, he walked away. That's the common story that's told, and that's just not the case. Based on Darwin's own words, he had really walked away from the Orthodox faith at a very early age. And so for me, that was the overriding historical lesson. But his compromise led him ultimately to compromise on the most blessed promise there is, and it's found here. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. The lesson from Darwin's life should tell us to examine our hearts and ensure that each one of us have that saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. Thank you very much.